I guess we will get started with chapter 3, drawing the veil. Right?
Chapter 3, yeah, it's interesting that the chapters don't have titles. There's subsections within the chapters have titles.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So, the drawing the veil refers to him not wanting to listen to the Russian couple have sex.
Right.
And he was so scandalized by that. That was a great way to kick off the chapter. I was like, why is this bothering you so much? I mean, he even says, it's a great description when it's like, he says, a struggling, a panting, a giggling, the offensive nature of which could not long remain hidden to the young man.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, good-naturedly as he tried to put a harmless construction on them, as if like actual harm is being done. And then, the narrator seems to have a little fun with Hans. He's like, well, what was it Hans was experiencing? Was it chastity? Was it purity of soul? Was it hating to look facts in the face, describing it to an obscure sense of awe and piety? He's like, all this stuff is going on. And then finally, on the next page, he responds to all this. He seemed to hear a chase about the room. A chair fell over. Someone was caught and seized. Long, loud kissing ensued, and the music below. And then he began to blush through the powder, for what he had all along seen coming was come, and the game had passed quite frankly over into the bestial. Good Lord, he thought. And I just... Not a very good look for Hans to be this bothered.
Well, yeah, so...
I don't know. I don't think the narrator means it to look good for him.
No, I think, we talked a little bit last time about all the emphasis in that forward about the sort of commonness, the regular, normal guy.
Yeah.
And I kind of think, what we're getting in this section is this kind of judgment against this kind of common, kind of prudish, priggish kind of thing. It is weird, right? We've both been, I'm sure, in hotels or whatever, and somebody's getting it on next door, and there is, I will admit, this kind of, there's always a shock, even though this is partly what hotels are for.
Right.
There is that moment where you're like, is that, nah. It is.
Well, and I guess especially in a house of convalescents, it would be even more surprising than, as you say, a hotel. You kind of figure, well, there's a lot of this going on. And he just goes so out of his way. You're right. It would be a little bit shocking, and it would be a little bit like, oh dear. But he's like, he tells Joachim, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that guy's name right.
I looked it up in between, and it's like an old Hebrew, like a Germanized Hebrew, and so it's like, I have to look at it to get it right, but it's Joachim.
Okay. Yeah. So he tells Joachim, I don't even want to be introduced to them. And and eventually, during one of their meals pace chapter 3.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Absolutely,
the dining room is central.
It's paced by that. And during one of those meals, the Russian couple comes in, and Joachim says, "There's your neighbors," and it's like, and then when he goes to bed that night, they're doing it again.
Right.
And he's like, who would ever believe it?
Yeah.
So I think part of it too is it's not just that he overheard them having sex, but this is 3 times now in 2 days. So there's part of it, it's almost like a sitcom.
Right.
Where you're like, damn, that's more than I get it. You know what I'm saying?
It's like something that George would have brought to Jerry and
right.
Seinfeld.
Yeah, it'd be like, what's their secret? Married people are supposed to carry on this way.
Right, yeah. Well, and I think there's also this suggestion, and I think there's some research to back it up, that there's this kind of classed sort of metric, that the sort of upper class, hyper educated, neurotic types like us.
Yeah.
We're too distracted. We sit up and worry about things, right?
Yeah.
And then meanwhile there's this other sort of, class of people who are just time to get it on. You know,
like the beginning of Idiocracy.
yes.
The beginning where the upper class couple
Right,
is all
it's
like,
just not time. It's just not time.
And then meanwhile, Levon is like, I'm gonna fuck all y'all. You know?
And he like shoots his own testicles off. He gets them reattached. So you know, there is that kind of suggestion, and I think the previous readings have really worked to establish this idea that Hans, you know, for all of the kind of tragedy of his life, he is. I mean,
He's a snob.
I think last time we were kind of talking about him in kind of in relation to grad school type stuff, where we were saying he was sort of educated into this upper class, even if he doesn't quite have access to the money.
That's right.
And so what we're getting is that kind of like Downton Abbey, like, well, I never,
Right.
you know, kind of.
And then, you know, it's not just him that's a snob. Like, in a way, the narrator is too. I mean, you predicted rightly last time we talked that this novel was very much on the verge of becoming cosmopolitan. And so, you know, we meet the Mexican woman, which how heartbreaking is that?
Yeah.
All she can say is both of them. She's going to lose her sons.
And the fact that it comes out in this rhyming French
Yes.
is the only thing she can say that anyone understands.
And, you know, there's an English woman, there's, you know, the American who had died in his bed, there are Germans, there are Russians.
the good Russians and the bad Russians.
And so, but through it all, like, you know, I just don't know what to make of the narrator because, you know, when the dwarf waits on them and then they're convalescing on the patios and he says across the way, was that really a dwarf? Mm-hmm. And Joachim is like, shh, keep it down, you know. And then there's another woman who gets all excitable. And
Stoll.
I think it might be a different woman where Hans thinks to himself, it just seemed weird that somebody as insignificant as her would even get worked up about anything.
Right.
And there are little digs like that shot through the chapter that like these people are just beneath him, you know, and even the woman that Joachim is crushing on that wears the ruby ring,
Right.
you know, and Hans has a crush now, the door slammer, and you know, he keeps thinking, who does she remind me of?
Right.
But he's also criticizing, he's clearly got a hand fetish.
There's something,
because we're told, you know, well, he always noticed the hands first.
And he has that special soap for his hands.
Yeah, and then he's like, when he first sees her hands, he's like, oh, those are common schoolgirl hands. They haven't been manicured. Mm. But then in the wild Freudian dream at the end, it's like, oh, he kissed that hand.
Right.
And so I'm interested.
Palm up.
And I'm interested to see if that gets more traction, like Hans's kind of sexual... well, you said it, like anxiety neuroses. Neurosis is a good word for this chapter, for this book so far, I think. You know, there is a Freudian overtow to it.
Well, I have specifically not looked up anything aside from odd bits of just like, well, what is that? Kind of looking up.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at what critics say. I haven't looked at what SparkNotes says, or you know, any of the even just basic stuff.
Yeah.
Because I'm still in that phase where I feel like I want to get like all the way in the groove before I start doing that. Because you know, I like this idea that we had about just kind of, you know, a cold reading, just kind of like, you know, we're just like two dudes in 1925, like, hey, there's this new book that came out.
Yes.
But I'm also kind of, I'm thinking that there obviously are, you know, mountains of scholarship on this, and there seems like there's so many things that people would kind of think about, and I think about the way that illness kind of manifests in this, both in terms of this neuroses, you know, with that. What's his name? Not Krakowski, but the other one, Baron. Baron, who wants to psychoanalyze everybody, and Hans is so scared.
I think it's Krakowski that wants to psychoanalyze.
You're right, because they meet him the first night.
Yeah.
And so, you know, he wants to do that, and Hans is like, oh, no, not me.
Yeah.
It's like the old Monty Python thing where they're checking into the hotel, and it says, you know, sex, and the wife writes, no, please, we're English. You know?
Right.
He's like, not me.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
But so there's this kind of sickness there, and then this phase. We might circle back to this. We haven't gotten to this portion of the reading, but I think sort of midway through this chapter, during one of the rest intervals, and I can't tell if it's a dream or if it's in real life. I think we're supposed to be confused for a lot of this novel, just like Hans seems to be kind of confused about waking and dreaming
Yeah.
and all that.
Yeah.
But there's a short passage that suggests that he's gotten sick, that his handkerchief has blood on it.
That's right. I think that's real.
Page 78.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily want to jump us that far ahead.
Yeah.
But just saying that sickness is a thing. And there
Yeah.
are all these kind of manifestations of sickness. But there's also this kind of class stuff that we were already talking about. And the other thing, and I don't know if I'm just bringing this, that thing about if all you've got is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. I keep kind of thinking about this in terms of higher ed for some reason, and this feels very much to me like the same sort of story I would tell about a country mouse who moved into a dorm at capital city state. Here's this guy who has led, by all accounts, responsible, disciplined life. I mean, I love he's got the thing very early in today's chapter. He makes the pro smoking argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where he says, I don't understand why anyone wouldn't smoke. Yeah, here's on 47. I don't understand it. Hans Castorp said, "I never can understand how anybody cannot smoke.
Yeah.
It deprives a man of the best part of life." And he's eloquent.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And he has that whole stock of cigars that he has doles out through the day, and so and he's got his beer that he drinks at breakfast for his anemia.
Which I think kicks off the phenomenon you're talking about that happens throughout the chapter.
Yeah, it gets him in trouble this
Well,
this time.
you were saying sometimes you had a hard time telling whether he was dreaming or awake. I think the early alcohol,
right,
kind of, well, at one point it said it felt like his head had been thudded.
Yeah.
And his eyes are always drooping and bloodshot. I mean, he's drunk through much of the day,
But
and I
that's
think
not-
Thomas Mann says it without saying.
But that's not his ordinary experience.
Right.
So there's something going on.
Yeah.
They brought him like the good stuff.
Yeah.
Or something. I don't.
Yeah.
Like he thought he was having his ordinary kind of small beer breakfast, and they brought him Fireball. Or
You're right.
something,
Right. Right.
But so he that aside. For the most part, he seems to be this kind of perfect, kind of middle class, disciplined, almost puritanical
Yeah.
sort of guy in terms of putting in the work.
Yeah.
And
Although ironically, he doesn't like work, and
Right,
he even admits
right.
to Settembini, he's like, God knows that's true, and the devil does too.
Right.
That work is hard.
yeah, and so he comes up to this place, and discovers all these people who are gleefully, why bother?
Right.
All the way to the extent of the woman we hear about sort of towards the end of today's reading, who is cured, but faking it because she doesn't want to go home.
Yeah, she's like, this is my home.
This is it. you
Yeah.
know? And so, I mean, and it just felt a lot like, I don't know how your experience went, but it felt a lot to me like those moments early in college when you're in a dorm room in a group of people late at night, and somebody's like, well, what is the difference between space and time?
Right.
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 And I actually I pulled it up because I kind of went through a phase where I was pretty obsessed with Heidegger when I was younger, and I thought, well, here's another German thinking about these same things, and I think it's worth noting. I don't know what the actual connection is here, but his kind of landmark thing is called Being and Time, and he published it in 1927. Now, this came out in German in 24, but I find it hard to believe that the ideas that led to Heidegger's book, weren't already kind of floating around in the world.
Right.
He himself was probably
He
talking
had probably been giving lectures.
Yeah.
He might have read this book.
Right.
You
right.
know.
And so I'm wondering if there isn't some kind of fabric in the moment happening here where this is something, the other thing I kept thinking about, and I think this is because of the other book we're reading right now, is that line early in Prufrock about, let us go forth like a patient
Etherized upon a table. Yeah.
And this is the feeling that this chapter gives me is something I think similar to that,
Yeah, and I mean, Eliot was writing around that same.
About at the same time.
That is so interesting to think about. And speaking of space and time and the attention it got again in this chapter, I think now we're seeing that is just a major motif in the book. And Settembrini, and I'm kind of curious what you thought about that guy, but he says on 56, he starts making this surreal spatial connection between, to get to the Magic Mountain, you had to go up a steep climb. You went up, up, up. Mm-hmm. But Settembrini says, you were bold indeed, thus, and he invokes the Greek judges of the dead, and says that's who Krukowski and Behrens are. And he says, you're bold indeed, thus to descend to these depths, peopled by the vacant and idle dead. Descend, Herr Settembrini, I protest. Here I have climbed up some 5,000 feet to get here. And I just thought this line was important. Even if Settembrini is kind of a con man, which I feel like he might be, I don't know. But he says at the top of the next page, that was only seeming. Upon my honor, it was an illusion, the Italian said with a decisive wave of the hand. We are sunk enough here, aren't we, Lieutenant? So this idea that you went up to go down, right? Like they descended into some Greek underworld, and the way they got there was by going up. And and I couldn't help but think of the title. And your comment just now made me think of the title, that here is a place where they're just over it. Like the concerns of the world down there or up there, wherever that world is. Geographically, it's down. But philosophically, it's up. They're just shades. They're just shadows going through the stuff together. And I find that to be such an interesting way to think about not only illness, but maybe any kind of closed society. I mean, the dorm comparison was apt, but if you even think about in academia, the general understandings and the give and go of just our campus, how easy it can be to get sucked into thinking that's all there is. Well, something we've been resisting of late. But
right. Well, and I've been kind of I think along the same lines. We're talking about the class stuff here and the elitism and that way. And the snobbery but in some ways everybody at this place is a kind of cultural elite.
You have to spend money to be there,
right? Exactly.
I felt like I'm kind of embarrassed, but not really because I was reading it cold. But last week I was kind of reading it as they're trapped there. They won out, but they can't get out. Mm-hmm. But now I'm beginning to suspect. First off, if you don't got the money, they'll kick you out.
Right.
I don't know, but it just feels like there were all these references to. He would leave them for 6 weeks until their check cleared.
Right.
And,
exactly.
There
was that summer treatment, winter treatment.
Yeah.
Settembre. Settembrini.
Settembrini
was kind of joking about when they first met.
Right.
Making it out like this is kind of a con.
Yeah.
In fact, that
they're making money here. They're not. So it's not the same.
And the suggestion was that Krukowski was also sleeping with the women.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so it's not like Cuckoo's Nest, at least in my mind anymore. Mm-hmm. It's more like voluntary. And expensive, just abdicating your responsibilities, abdicating your worldliness to this. And maybe that's what makes it magic, is that you just surrender. You go to this place and it's over, and you're just waiting to die.
Well, what this made me think about in that context, and I'm agreeing with you here. And I don't think you've seen this, although I absolutely think you should, is BoJack Horseman.
Right,
And there's a sequence that involves him going to rehab. And I won't say a whole lot because I don't want to ruin anything that you haven't seen yet. But one of the gimmicks is that they're like, okay, 28 days, good luck. And he's like, I'm not ready. And he's this former child star, or not child star, but he'd been famous as a young actor. He'd made a bunch of money on this kind of cheesy, afternoon sitcom. I think supposed to be modeled on Full House, or something like that. Where he's like this unexpected dad figure.
Right.
And so he's got all this money from this, even though he's kind of a train wreck otherwise. And so they're like 28 days, and he's like, nope, not ready. And so he just keeps like buying another 28 days.
Yes.
And spends like this, I don't even remember, but this inordinate amount of time in rehab. And I think partly the show, and the show's deeply complex in terms of especially about how you're supposed to feel about BoJack, and in some ways cheats, and there's a lot going on there. But I think in some ways this is really the closest model to the kind of like sanatorium from the early 1900s. It's like this place where like you're just kind of allowed to just go like, I can't do it, and these people come and take care of you like as a grown adult.
It's
And
all
I can't
about
think of too many.
It's just eating, resting, and getting some exercise. And I don't know about you, like, what was your impression of the village, like the Davos, where you walk in? Like, I got the impression that that's been taken over by Sanatoria.
Well,
that the only people in that town are people that are visiting it from Sanatoria or homeowners that rent. Like, you got the impression it was like not really a town.
The narrator kind of tells us so much when they're doing the walk.
Yeah.
They either walk uphill or downhill.
Right.
And when they walk downhill towards the town, the narrator's like, oh, it's not even really a town anymore. It's just more of the hospital.
It's more of the hospital, and so, like, the people playing tennis, you got the impression were, like, residents of a different sanatorium.
Yeah. Do you know...
There's more than one sanatorium on this mountain.
Right.
Like, this one is the one
and they
we're
all have their
concerned
own
with.
shtick.
Yeah.
But do you know the Warren Zevon song, Rehab Mountain?
Yes.
There's a kind of a, it's like, I'm raking leaves with Liza,
Yeah.
and doing laundry, and so it's like this weird paradox, right, of like removing yourself from the world, but also kind of like immersing yourself very intensely into certain parts of the world. And in this case, of course, it's the dining hall, right?
Yeah.
The dining room is where everything happens.
We either met or got to know better a whole cast of characters whose names I'm nowhere near keeping straight. Madame Stoll clearly is an important character who, you kind of get this old school style from Thomas Mann that authors just, it's not done anymore. To do the physical attributes as reflective of what's inside the soul. Right, like, that used to be the way it was done.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're, Madame Stoll is horrible, so she's also ugly.
Right.
And it's like...
That's how you can tell.
That's how you can tell. And I mean, I would say Hollywood still plies that trade a little bit, although it does love its femme fatales and its handsome rakes, to be sure. But it kind of jarred me. I'm just not used to reading, because we're all so woke.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that derogatorily. I think
no.
it's a good thing that we're past that.
Yeah, it's a little old school.
Yeah.
Well, I actually I made some notes before we came in, and I was thinking about Settembrini.
Yeah.
I think more, but I think what you're talking about fits into this, perfectly well too. But and it also kind of fits a little bit into this kind of wokeness. Like, one of the things that I'm finding a little tiresome, and this is not a capital C complaint.
Yeah.
But this is very kind of primitive, like single bass drum modernist symbolism happening here with all of these characters.
Yeah.
And I full disclosure, right? It's a translation. It's writing out of this different culture. So I'm not trying to sell this thing short.
Yeah.
But there is this part of me that always kind of gets a little eye rolly when I'm like, okay, so we've got Mr. September, we've got Miss Machine Gun.
Yeah.
We've got like these kind of like almost like the medieval morality plays.
Right.
And so,
yeah, where you could name people, like, you could give a character a name like Wormbrain.
Right.
And nobody would blink an eye.
Yeah. Like Patience.
Yes. Yes.
And so I feel like, what we're seeing is this kind of morality play, this kind of suggestion that, like, what's at stake here is this kind of Victorian sense of character and that kind of thing. But it's all wrapped up in my, kind of very imperfect understanding of kind of high modernism.
Right.
And I know it like ran the world for like 50 years.
Yes.
But I also, I'm sort of just personally over it. I feel like it is overly simplistic.
Yeah.
At the same time that it tries to invoke this kind of great complexity of thought, like, well, what is time? And, at the same time, it's very naive, I think, in terms of its characterization and its handling of things. And partly because its own snobbery, I think, sort of blinds it. So the problem I had with Settembrini, is he's just this illusion machine. He's quoting that Italian poet with the hymn to Satan.
Dante and Plutarch.
He trots out the Greek mythology. He's the one who invokes that. There's the Shakespeare from like 3 and 20 Kiss Me,
right,
from Twelfth Night,
right. I didn't know the play, but I was like, that's got to be from Shakespeare.
And so he's just
well, Joachim introduces him as a literary man.
Right. This is
Thomas Mann's caricature of us.
Right. Kind of. Right. He's Herr Professor.
Yeah.
Herr Doctor Professor.
Yeah.
And he's a little bit of a he's again you see Hans kind of get his prudishness kind of ruffled when he's like flirting with the girl, when Settembrini is flirting with the girls, and he's like, that's not proper, and all this, so he's like, he's like this awful character for the English professor, right? Like he's spouting off all this crap that nobody else wants to read. He's flirting with like the women who are too young. He's holding forth while everybody else is just trying to get where they're going. Right. He's like, and another thing.
Yes.
So I found him kind of tiresome. I think we were supposed to, and I love that Hans is like, he keeps thinking of him as an organ grinder. Right, which is like so.
He even says to him, "No offense, but you kind of seem like an organ grinder to me."
Which just strikes me as like, like what's that gif from where the kid goes, that's racist,
right,
man. So he comes onto the scene, and I kind of feel like suddenly everything goes up to 11, right? But then it kind of fades back down. They go back to their rooms. They have these wonderful chairs with the built-in shades and all the blankets and everything just kind of starts to kind of float from there. And I think, aside from going basically up and down to the dining room, the whole thing's just this kind of weird haze.
It is. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Albin.
Yes.
I have
notes about him.
Threatening to kill himself over on page 79, that section. I wonder what your thoughts were about that. I mean, on the one hand, I guess I'll just start by saying it's this classic male move.
Right.
To get the ladies' attention by
playing with knives and guns.
Right, and also like just sort of the woe is me strategy that all men are familiar with, especially from like high school and college, it's like he's dark, he feels bad about himself, the women are going to want to heal him.
I blame Jane Eyre.
Yeah. And these women do. They're like, oh no, you will be healthy, you will be loved, please don't. She's like totally getting all this attention. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, this is a house of sickness, and death is also a big theme in this chapter. And Joachim has already talked about how, there was a young girl who they tried to give her the catechism and she screamed and kicked.
Right.
There was another time where he saw them, or where he knows that they bring the coffin in, even though it's behind the scenes. So Albin's got real problems. Like, he's sick of being there. So on the one hand, yes, he's grandstanding, but on the other, I think the reader is supposed to be like, well, damn, like, is there a point at which I just want to fucking end it if I was really just coughing up blood? And, had tuberculosis and I was never going to leave this place. Like, I can kind of feel him. Like, so I don't know. Like, how did you read that guy?
So I want to kind of go the long way around to that, because I was sort of distracted a little bit by his props.
Right.
He's got this knife from Calcutta.
Yeah.
He's got the revolver.
Yeah. Which is loaded,
right? To the hilt,
he
says, or whatever it is.
Like
it's somehow extra loaded.
Yeah.
And because of that, and then this name Albin, right, which is kind of like, I think has the same root as albumin, the white part of the egg yolk.
Okay.
Right? So he's this stiff whiteness, right? And so I can't help but think of him as this kind of, with the Calcutta connection, I can't help but think of him as this kind of like British imperialist.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says that he's not German,
right?
But I feel like what he's doing there is being kind of like the English equivalent of Hans, as this kind of like solid kind of like middle class bordering on aristocracy, he's the Englishman from the Fitzgerald novels, right? And it's just like, who's just like, he's fatalistic, he's kind of beautiful in his recklessness. He's haunted by,
by death.
All of these things, right?
Yeah.
He's he's a little bit like these Faulkner characters in the early Faulkner stories. The pilots who came back from World War I and just couldn't get over what they'd seen or what they'd done, and obviously I'm inventing things that might go with this guy,
right.
But my first reaction to him was okay. So this is representing a kind of like whiteness, a kind of stiffness, a certain kind of like Western masculinity, that, as you say, and this is for, I think, kind of obvious reasons right now, something that's really been on my mind lately. In fact, I think enough so that I'm going to kind of like move it to the front of my scholarship queue going forward, is this strategy of this kind of like dominant cultural force or dominant cultural identity working overtime to adopt this identity of victimhood,
right?
And this language of victimhood,
right?
That says, like, for instance, to borrow a very recent example, there's like, this massacre in Texas, and one of our representatives is saying, I know people are going to make fun of me for praying about this.
Right.
And it's like, oh, right, because this is about your hurt. Right?
Yes. Yes.
And so there's this. I think there's this strategy, and it goes way back to some earlier work that I did on these kind of like Reconstruction era novels from the South, that is very much about like adopting this position of victimhood. That is like what Western whiteness is on some level.
That's a great point.
And so I was kind of distracted by that. Now, whether this is cooked into the novel, I don't know. I
think that's kind of the thing that in today's reading reminded me a little bit of Melville's The Confidence Man anyway, and it wouldn't surprise me if Thomas Mann had read as Melville.
Yeah, it feels like
I don't know that he even knew English. I don't know anything about him, but he probably knew English. He probably read.
Translated.
That's true. And I think that one of Melville's great themes was to make fun of what you're talking about. Like he would the Confidence Man especially is chock full of these characters who want to present themselves as needy, as somehow in trouble, so that others would give them things.
Right.
And they're invariably, because of the time that it's written, all but one of the Confidence Men, or all the manifestations of whether it's one Confidence Man or multiple is like a huge debate about that novel.
Right.
But one manifestation is black.
Right.
The rest of them are all super stiff white guys, like you're talking about, all trying to present themselves as, no, I am the one who needs the most.
Right. I'm the one who's been hurt, who's been damaged.
I need the money.
I've
lost things. And Albin does have that going on. Now, it is true that, he's probably dying. So you got to throw that into the cake batter, too,
So, I do want to kind of circle back around and say, having said all that, and I'm interested in that, and I want to see what the novel does with him, I also think, being in a hospital for 3 years, and partly this is colored. I'm regularly visiting 3 people right now, like about once a week, at least one of them, who are absolutely in the process of dying.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of a new sort of life experience for me.
Yeah.
I used to joke around, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, and so there are these seasons, right? That like all your friends would be graduating, all your friends would be getting married, all your friends would be having babies, and apparently I've entered the season where, I know a lot of people who are dying.
Yeah.
And so, some of what I'm seeing, in this moment, has kind of made me kind of pause and reflect on like how long would I let this process go? And so Albin's saying, look, when I can't take it anymore, I'm just checking out.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it feels like this performance. It feels like a kind of bravado.
Right.
But it also,
it's also legit.
I just find it really hard to believe that somebody who spent more than about 6 weeks at this place, that the thought wouldn't have crossed them.
I think so. I think that's absolutely right. Look how much Hans has been through in one day.
This whole chapter was one day.
Yeah. Chapter 3 is one day.
Yeah. So there is that, and as you say, like he's sitting around the circle of ladies, and they're all like, "Oh no," which must be gratifying.
It's gotta be fun.
It's funny to me, like this feels like a scenario, like one of those kind of end of the world scenarios where the ordinary rules are suspended. And so I imagine there's a lot of getting it on happening.
Oh, yeah.
Besides just this Russian married couple.
Right. Well, we're told that the one guy turns the lights off on purpose.
Yeah.
But he's having an affair with another.
Right.
I don't remember their names, but Stoll. I think
she's just
her role is to dish.
Yeah.
They're like, we're going to get gossip from her.
Right.
And so I like that.
I feel like what she is maybe is a little bit of a counter narrator, right?
Yeah.
She's kind of like telling this other story, while the kind of somewhat stodgier narrator is like, no. But let me circle back to Albin for just a minute.
Yeah.
Because something that really stood out to me on page 81, the narrator tells us, so Hans is sort of annoyed, right? He's trying to nap, and this dude's going on about suicide.
Right. He and Joachim talk about that later.
It's like the quiet hour, dude.
Yeah. So doesn't somebody cry out, like, keep it down?
Yeah. There's something like that. And so, but at the same time, he has this, like, fascination with Albin right off the bat.
Yeah.
And towards the end of 81, right, he says, his reflections were dim and confused. It would be difficult to define them, but in effect, it seemed to him that though honor might possess certain advantages, yet shame had others, and not inferior advantages. And I think he's suggesting that Albin has sort of given up on the idea of honor, which I think I know it's early to sort of say this, but in this moment, I feel like when Hans talks about honor, he's talking about sort of properly keeping up appearances.
Yeah.
And here's Albin potentially being like genuinely fragile in front of people.
Yeah.
Which goes against I think in essence, like, Hans just doesn't believe in being honest, and I don't mean in the sense that he's a dirty liar, but he keeps this facade, and
it's a very Victorian. Yeah. And I guess modernism had to tackle that straight up because we were coming out of Victorian and into the modern era.
Right.
So it's like, I keep thinking about Hemingway as I read this, and Hemingway talking about, I think it's Farewell to Arms, where he talks about how, words like love and honor and all that stuff, didn't matter. What mattered was dates, places, times, and so, Thomas Mann seems to be writing in a moment where we are wrestling with, is it time to drop the facade and start being real, you know?
Right, and I think it's really interesting, right, because this is the narrator giving us that kind of limited insight into Hans's process.
Yeah.
And Hans frames this as a kind of option between honor and shame.
Right.
These are the two choices you
Right.
have. And on the one hand, is this kind of stiff, formality, doing the work that you don't love,
Yeah.
Putting on the clothes, doing, performing the role. And on the other hand, like, you're just kind of like this guy who's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so you have honor or you have shame.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of in between for him. And I think this is a really fascinating, vision of a really kind of a poisonous. I mean, I hate to invoke this term, but this to me is like the recipe, like one part honor, one part shame is how you get toxic masculinity.
Yes. Yes.
And so so this idea that you have the one or the other. I mean, this feels to me like exactly the kind of thing that gets you some of the kind of grosser things that we've seen in Western culture when it comes to especially kind of masculine power and efforts to maintain certain kinds of hegemony. And so, at the same time, though, I want to say it is also more of that kind of highfalutin, like, Settenbrini kind of, philosophizing, right? It's really, I think, an important thing to say about this novel that nothing really happens. There's a lot of thinking about abstractions, but he never just goes downstairs and punches the dude in the eye and says it's quiet hour.
Right. Not yet, anyway.
Like Hemingway.
Yeah.
Like Hemingway would have just he would have walked downstairs bare chested and just given the guy a shot.
Yeah.
And,
now where it does get real visceral is in the dining hall.
Yes.
Like, that is action. There's like all this talk about how it would have been awe-inspiring to watch if it wasn't so repulsive, and it's like they're eating so hard that food is literally flying off the plate as if they're throwing it at each other.
And they're the ones who seem to relish it.
Yeah.
And then the other ones who don't, and they're all eating so hard.
Yeah.
It's kind of, that's one of the really disturbing things. And it's also the kind of arena where you see the kind of social blood sports happen.
Yes.
As well.
Yes.
And I think that's a really interesting kind of connection. That, speaking of the dining room.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this slamming door thing.
Yeah, I mean, that turns out to be Madame Chocut,
right?
The one with the fascinating hands that he's going to dream about later.
Whose name, by the way, is basically means machine gun.
Yeah.
Right. So she's this like Freudian as hell thing.
Loud, there's something just
rapid fire,
something going on, and she. The first couple of times, it was interesting. This goes into your comment very much about how the chapter is so dreamy and haze-like, that the first couple of times the door slams, he's like annoyed, but not annoyed enough to look and see who did it. Mm-hmm. And that feels like the kind of thing that would happen in a dream, where it's like, oh, who was that slammed the door? Well, I guess I won't look.
Right.
But the third time even says out loud, okay, this time I'm going to look and see who did it. I found that to be really like maybe this goes with what you're saying about how not much is happening in the novel for that to count as a big action, like to just turn your head and look. So,
well, I think it's fascinating. Right, he's got to work so hard. He's got to turn his whole body. He can't just move his head.
No, it's like a big deal to look.
Yeah.
And when he does look, I think it's clear to me that he's super attracted to her. And I mean, I want to skip all the way to the end of the chapter when he's dreaming about her.
Well, before you do that, let me just say, in that chapter where he does look, and I think this is on page 75, although I'm not seeing, I thought I underlined it. Oh no, here it is on 77, sorry. Right, he finally does make himself turn and look. And it's this a fleeting observation that her cheekbones were broad and her eyes narrow, a vague memory of something. And then, of course, go invoking the subtitle.
Yeah.
Of course, a female.
Yes.
And it's such an interesting introduction to what's obviously going to be this important thing. That he's been bothered by this slamming door, and apparently there's only one person in this entire establishment is slamming this door.
Yeah.
He's been bothered by this at least a couple times.
Yeah.
He turns, and the thought that the first thought that he articulates, right, is this kind of vague, she's something familiar, something, reminiscent. and then of course it's a woman slamming the door.
Right.
And it's such a mishmash of things.
Yes.
And I think I maybe invoked this last time, but I can't remember. But what it really felt like to me was a kind of Confederacy of Dunces moment, where Ignatius is like on the cusp of this win, right? And he steals the victory from himself.
Right.
A female.
Right, right. And then, the Englehart says, that is Madame Chauchat. She is so heedless, a charming creature. I like that juxtaposition, like heedless and charming.
Yeah.
So she's being set up as this modern woman, I think, in a lot of ways. And when he has the dream on 92, she keeps invading the dream. And the first time, I thought a little bit about Van Halen, where it says, it seemed to the dreamer that he was in the school courtyard, blah, 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 and was in the act of borrowing a lead pencil from Madame Chauchat, who seemed to be there too. She gave him a half-length red pencil in a silver holder. It's very phallic to me.
Oh, yeah.
And warned him in an agreeable, husky voice to be sure to return it to her after the hour. And I just, I was just thinking about, even though I think they're supposed to be classmates, I still couldn't help but think about that Van Halen line from Hot for Teacher, where he's like, I dropped my pencil,
Right,
right. But then at the end, it's like clear now that he's into her, at least in this Freudian way on 93. Yeah. Instead of going to the good Russian table, the unmannerly female glided noiselessly to Hans Kastrup's side and without a word reached him her hand, not the back, but the palm to kiss. Hans Kastrup kissed that hand, which was, again, not overly well kept, but rather broad with stumpy fingers, the skin roughened next to the nails. And there swept over him anew from head to foot the feeling of reckless sweetness. And so that mirrors the heedless, charming. He digs that she's modern. I mean, I guess she could be a flapper, right?
There's
something. I mean, I don't know, but it's like she's... Again, back to Hemingway, there's this fascination with athletic, masculine
kind of
women,
lithe, boyish,
like Brett in Sun Also Rises is coded as very beautiful, but also could easily be working out in the gym, like shooting hoops.
There's a lot of slim-hipped in
a lot of striding when she walks, and pants wearing and shit.
And the line right after you stop reading, right? He tried to imagine himself free of the burden of a good name and tasted the boundless joys of shame. So there's some kind of responsibility he's feeling that would not allow him to pursue this thing, But he also kind of recognizes, the boundless joys of shame.
Yeah.
And I don't think what I'm hearing there is a kind of hedonism, right? This is not like the Joker saying no rules,
right?
But
and it's not even just about sex,
right? No, I think it's something. It's something about freedom from what I think we're going to find is this incredibly oppressive sense of responsibility that he has, even if it's just this abstract sense of responsibility. I don't know, but yeah, she. And again, in this somewhat tiresome way that I associate with modernism, she represents this freedom from a life that he has both chosen and not.
And that's a trope that persists to this day. I mean, Dana often complains about how in rom-coms, mostly, there always has to be this woman who's coded as cool, and the ways in which she's cool is that she's quirky, she drinks bourbon, she's maybe into astrology, goes around barefoot all the time, probably works in an art gallery. It's like, how many of these jobs are there in the art galleries, you know?
Right.
And so she's like the opposite of his corporate rat race. She takes him to the funky restaurants and the weird concerts, and and it's just like a trope.
Well, I think of Pretty Woman as being kind of like the moment of that, right? Where Julia Roberts kind of like somewhat boho prostitute.
Yeah.
What is it that Jason Alexander's character says? Like what's so magic about you that he doesn't care about $100 million anymore?
Right.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so there is that sense that that this woman appears and she's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? In maybe like a I'm thinking of the. I'm blanking on his name. The Campbell Hero's Journey.
The Hero's Journey, yeah. The hero with a thousand faces.
Yeah, that she's kind of like this obstacle on Hans's. Hans has kind of entered this underworld, and now here she is, like, representing this thing that kind of, like, would put him off track. Except maybe that's the thing to do.
Maybe that's what he wants. Was it the Bob Dylan line? Your debutante knows what you need, but I know what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it in some ways it's a very traditional feeling.
Wow.
Story that I keep wanting to tie back to kind of like the French Chevalier romances, the kind of precursors to Arthur. As well as this kind of big modernist thing that's happening all over. I mean, and I keep thinking about the collision of all the things, and partly, I'll just admit flatly here, partly what you're hearing is a little bit of how much I don't like 20-year-old me,
right?
Who would have just fallen on this like a starving man on a meal.
You would have really liked this book.
Well, because it keeps offering all these opportunities to be the smart guy.
Right.
Because it's coded in this way that's like, well, if you know the right things, you'll understand.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficulty that for me now that doesn't present the kind of achievement that it did at the time, and I just find it kind of tiresome.
Yeah.
These kind of inside jokes. But at the same time, I think about all the things that are colliding in this moment, kind of in this part of the world.
Yeah.
And we've got almost all the heavy hitters of kind of like Western modernist literature kind of coming through this zone, right? Eliot writes about the Stamborghese in The Wasteland that's not too far from Davos.
Yeah.
We've got, Thomas Mann, we've got Sigmund Freud down the road doing his thing, we've got Heidegger not too far away doing his thing, and all of these kinds of, for the moment, these kind of shocking kind of new ways to think about the world are just recklessly colliding into each other, and all these people are like, well, I got to figure this out over a 900-page novel.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, obviously it's a monument and it's an achievement, but I have to say, and this is not me saying I don't like it, but I have to say there's a little bit of a kind of, I can feel a grind. I can feel a little bit like, I know how this works.
Yeah.
It's almost a little too practiced.
Yeah.
Feeling in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I guess we should talk about where we want to go from here.
Yeah, before we're out of time.